thanks everyone for joining. My name is Lauren Windling, and I am the Director of Institutional Success at Collaboratory. And we are really excited and thrilled today to have two wonderful guests from UCLA, Bimi Maharemli and Shalom Stab, who will be presenting and sharing their work specifically at UCLA, in recognizing and rewarding community engaged scholarship in academic personnel review. So they've done a lot of really hard and really good work at UCLA, and we're really excited to have them share the work that they've done. So I will kick it off to Shalom and Bimi to introduce themselves and to get going. We'll have about 30 minutes here for our presentation, and then we'll reserve the last 20 or so for questions. So while you're listening to the presentation and hearing all of this good work, if you have questions for Bimi and Shalom, please drop them in the chat. Either in the group chat, or you can directly message me, and then we'll facilitate some Q&A after the presentation. So appreciate you all joining and listening. So I will again pass it to Shalom and Bimi. Thanks again for joining.
Thank you, Lauren, and good day to everybody. I'm Shalom Stab. I'm the director of UCLA's Center for Community Engagement, and I'm joined by my colleague.
Hi, all. I'm Bimi Maharemli, and I'm the Associate Director for Strategic Initiatives. I'm working with Shalom at UCLA Center for Community Engagement. Great to be here.
You can see the screen, the shared slides now, everybody? Okay, so our goal in the next half an hour is to share with you some of our experiences in developing a plan and trying to carry out that plan to embed recognition of community engaged scholarship in academic personnel review.
To start, oh, hold on, I lost the screen. 1 second, Shalom. Oh, here it is. Okay. To start, community engaged scholarship was identified as an issue by UCLA faculty and by external review. And so this happened in two major fronts, one internally at UCLA. And so two major reports identified this as an issue to be better recognized and rewarded. One is the UCLA report of the Task Force on Civic Engagement in 2017. And then again in 2020, UCLA Strategic Priorities document on global and local engagement. And then also when UCLA went up for reclassification in 2015, the Carnegie elective reclassification for community engagement, this was identified as an issue that we had to make progress on by our next reclassification.
So in the 2020 Strategic Priorities document, the Center for Community Engagement was named as one of the principal responsible entities for advancing recognition of community engaged scholarship and academic personnel review. As a result of that authorization, we developed a report called Recognizing Community Engaged Scholarship in consultation with deans and with the Council on Academic Personnel Review. Bemi had a lead on this report development, doing a lit review, consulting with peer research universities, consulting with national subject experts, surveying selected disciplinary associations, and significantly interviewing 50 faculty members across the College of UCLA. So the college represents the divisions of social sciences, humanities, life, and physical sciences.
So during this process, which was about a little over a year-long process, in 2020 to 2021, we were working on that report. Our focus was on community engaged scholarship. And I think most of this audience knows what this is, and we share definition here from the Carnegie elective classification framework, while also in our process of developing this report and recommendations, we were inclusive of many models across multiple fields and their synergies and described here.
And this was critical because as we spoke with people across the university, terminology differed. So we are comfortable with community engaged scholarship, but in particular fields, it's translational scholarship, it's public impact scholarship, and the term community engaged scholarship didn't necessarily resonate. So that being very aware and sensitive to how different fields describe this work became really critical. So we framed when we present this on campus, this slide would not have our framing as the title. But in this audience, what we're trying to do here is share with you how we frame things, kind of a meta presentation here. So in the course of all of this work, what we identified were characteristics of engaged scholarship. The implicit message here is that these characteristics differ in some way from other more traditional forms of solitary scholarship or even collaborative scholarship, but that don't involve collaborations with community. And so on this slide, you see several attributes that distinguish engaged scholarship. And these were the stumbling blocks or the pain points that faculty consistently reported to us that made it difficult to make this legible in the context of academic personnel review. The products of this scholarship are sometimes published in traditional disciplinary outlets, but often in non-traditional venues. The work is often multidisciplinary. The work often includes multiple co-authors, including community partners. It's work that integrates research, teaching, and service that makes it difficult to compartmentalize and present that in a dossier in a single category. And perhaps most significantly, the work requires significant relationship building. So there's a time factor involved that to develop the relationships, to cultivate the relationships, and to nurture them so that which has a direct impact on quality and impact. So that last one is important because it's a variable for which the individual scholar has less control. And so time to completion is a critical issue.
So again, just sharing our process in terms of how we were framing the problem. One is that there are impediments and disincentives to community engaged research. But this is despite the fact that engagement, global and local, is core to UCLA's mission as a public university. What we found, and we'll go into this more when we talk about the findings of our discussions with faculty, but what we found is that the academic review process broadly and specifically at UCLA discourages community engaged scholarship by not recognizing those distinctive characteristics that Shalom just discussed. And there's the specific question of treating community engaged scholarship as scholarly activity, as research and as teaching, and not just as service. Sometimes it can be service, but it can also be a scholarly activity.
So we also made the case in our presentations across campus about why this makes a difference. So we're a public institution. There's an expectation from the public and from from funders that research should have broader societal impact. One of the other things that really resonates on our campus is the cohort of students are looking to connect their studies.
Okay. Yeah.
Somebody's microphone is on. That current students are looking to connect their studies to critical social issues. And not just students, but particularly current faculty and new and future faculty, meaning the faculty that we want to be able to recruit. And so right now, UCLA is actively recruiting new faculty in particular fields to increase representation of African-American faculty. UCLA is looking to achieve a Hispanic serving institution status, and that includes recruiting new Latinx faculty. And there's no question that these junior faculty and future faculty are committed to making their scholarship relevant to the communities that they are a part of. And if we are recruiting them and then not recognizing them for the very work that they're being recruited to do, that's a problem. And that will have an impact on the UCLA ability to retain those faculty and have those faculty thrive.
Okay, so sharing some of our findings from the interviews I conducted with faculty across the college. So as I said, we interviewed over 50 faculty, and all of them variously defined using different types of ways of engaged scholarship, whether it was public engagement, an activist movement building or contribution approach, publicly engaged scholarship, and more. In some way, they identified as viewing engaged scholarship into their research, teaching, or service. And so faculty across levels from assistant to full reported feeling unsupported. So it wasn't just the pre-tenure, it was all the way up to senior full faculty. And that there was a cost associated with that, and that it was their work was, well, not just considered invisible, but often there was a cost to it. And then there was also across the faculty that I spoke with that engaged scholarship needs to be reviewed or considered as research or teaching, not just as service. And it was interesting, oftentimes it was neglected to be counted in the service bucket as well. Like it was often even invisible in that space. And then there was also a need for clear, transparent criteria and understanding of what it means for engaged scholarship to be excellent and to have impact, and at every level, because again, we've talked about that can look different in different disciplines and departments, but at the same time, all the way to the top of the institution, there's some important signaling that can happen for the understanding that they should be recognized.
The reference to CAP in the last word of that slide is the Council on Academic Personnel, which is the Academic Senate Committee. That's the final review for tenure and promotion cases.
Mm-hmm.
So the current circumstances that we found and documented at UCLA in the course of this work, a lack of consistency from department to department. So some departments actively do evaluate and recognize community engaged scholarship, and other departments make it very difficult. So that really broad range of what happens. A lack of transparency of criteria for how their work is evaluated, and a lack of university level recognition. The Council on Academic Personnel had no explicit frame of reference for considering cases where community engaged scholarship is central to the faculty member's dossier. And it wasn't that CAP rejected this. Over a series of meetings that I had with the members of CAP, there was certainly openness to it at every stage, including the earliest stages of these conversations. But it was significant that they had no explicit frame of reference. And what was particularly striking, because I was having conversations at every level, faculty were saying, well, we need the dean to take initiative on this. And the dean would say, well, until CAP gives me a signal, I can't really do anything. Or the dean might say, well, I need the department to step up. And the departments would maybe jump up to the level of CAP and say, well, CAP has no clear criteria. So nobody was taking the first move because everybody was expecting that somebody else had to take the first move.
Yeah, and one thing to add to the previous slide in terms of lack of consistency is, while there were some departments that were really good at appreciating that there were scholars in their department who were practicing this, so there was appreciation from it. Among the faculty that I spoke with, you still it wasn't necessarily encouraged, and that you could still advance without doing community engaged scholarship, while it might be appreciated, but it wasn't necessarily encouraged, if that makes sense. In terms of national models, so we had discussions with national leaders and universities across the country to get a better idea of different models that were in place. And so this is sort of a simple sort of distilling the three different models that we came across. So one is the decentralized criteria with an institutional framework model from UNC Greensboro. I see Emily here today. It's nice to see you. And so this is sort of sharing a bit of that model where it's recognized at the top institutionally, and then each unit from the division all the way down to the departments are asked to talk about what that means in terms of standards and criteria, what community engaged scholarship means for them in the context of their unit and their discipline and things like that. Another approach is the opt-in supplemental review model. So this happens, for example, at the University of Minnesota. So you can decide to have an opt-in supplemental review of your community engaged scholarship by a community of community engaged scholars. And that then you can have that done in terms of a holistically, both in terms of engaged research and teaching, or just engaged research, or just engaged teaching. You choose that, you indicate that earlier on in your process, and then that then informs the standard academic review. And then another model is the continuum of scholarship model that Syracuse uses. So it's acknowledging that across the continuum, right, from traditional scholarship to engagement integrated across the scholarship to in between, where you can have some elements, and that scholars can situate themselves along this continuum, and it'll be evaluated in terms of where they situate themselves.
And so this was an important step in the process, because having identified these multiple models, it allowed us to speak with people on campus and get their perspective about which of these models might be most appropriate at UCLA. And as you'll see, we gravitated to the decentralized criteria within an institutional framework model, given the scale of UCLA and the fact that it is such a decentralized institution. So we developed a series of recommendations across different levels. And what this slide shows you is the university level recommendations. So we delivered our report to the Executive Committee of the Academic Senate and to the Council on Academic Personnel. That was the principal audience for our report. The report also, from the outset, went to the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, to deans at every school and division of the university, to the network of UCLA community engaged faculty, numbering in the hundreds. But we specifically recommended to the Academic Senate to disseminate the report, to appoint a committee to guide the establishment of Academic Senate policy, to review and adopt the UC Berkeley statement recognizing community engaged scholarship. And this was critical because UC Berkeley, so one of our sister UC campuses, had at the Academic Senate level recognized community engaged scholarship in the, I believe it was the
April, I think, wasn't it April?
In the several months before the issuing of our report, so in the immediate preceding academic year. Mm-hmm. And we also recommended instituting an annual workshop for the new members of the Council on Academic Personnel to familiarize them with principles and practices and criteria for review. So these were our initial recommendations at the university level.
Okay, so now going to the next level of our recommendations, which is at the division school level policy and practices. So here we did this. We convened information sessions across each school and division. There's, I think, nursing still may be pending, but we were many information sessions with the faculty executive committees of these schools and divisions were held in the last academic year. And then also another recommendation at the division school level was to appoint a council or working group of engaged scholars within each school division to formulate guidance to have that clear, transparent criteria faculty, and we heard was needed for faculty, right? And so this was launched in the spring of last year. We'll go into more detail on that process for us in a bit, but that was launched with social sciences in the spring. And the plan is that will create a model and sort of be a catalyst for other divisions and schools, and other divisions and schools have expressed interest in sort of using the social sciences model. And then thirdly here, we also highlighted Collaboratory as a part of our divisional and school level policies and practices, and encouraging all UCLA community engaged scholars to utilize UCLA Collaboratory to record and track their record of public facing and community engaged work. And that should be encouraged at the division school level. And we would work with the division school level to help provide that guidance and resources to do that.
So what you have here is kind of a timeline of the dissemination of the report. So what's important to know here is that I came to UCLA in fall of 2018. So this is my 5th year now. So 4 years ago is when I started thinking about working on promotion and tenure issues, and built on that 2017 task force report. And then when I was named as the co-lead for advancing the strategic priority for local and global engagement, in which this was specifically named, that was 2020, that gave me the ability to move this forward institutionally. And it is also what gave me the ability to reconfigure my own staff and create a position for associate director for strategic initiatives, into which I hired Bami. So I mention all this because the timeline for developing this is really a multi-year timeline. Then working on the report in academic year 2021, we were able to use that report and get that report out into the community. You see in the top section here, all the folks that we were initially able to reach while we were waiting for the academic senate to officially respond. And there was a kind of comedy of errors of how that delivery of our report got lost by the academic senate, and we didn't know that. And so instead of getting a response for them in a matter of months, a couple of months, it took almost 9 months to get a response. So we just kept working during that academic year. And you see in the lower section of this slide, the range of meetings that we convened or that we asked to present in. And the idea was, even while we were waiting for the academic senate to respond officially, we were functioning as community organizers, basically, and working through networks of folks who were sympathetic and interested in the cause, and working to present to people who might be skeptical or resistant to the cause. But getting the word out and engaging the campus community around this was really the work of academic year 21-22.
Yeah, that's a really good point, is the community organizing approach, identifying champions, faculty champions who've been really helpful to us, going to those meetings. And we would take lots of notes during those meetings because, so we took the report, we really leveraged it. We created different slide decks, right? So that became different slide decks that we'd use to these meetings. Then the slide decks would be refined after the meetings as we'd have these conversations and get input, both negative and positive. I mean, that was fascinating about what we were trying to do. And then taking the feedback from the meeting of, with the FEC of the School of Education, for example, and then being able to reflect and think about that for subsequent meetings and sharing the feedback that we got across, with colleagues across the campus, because it would be this very iterative process where we would continue to learn. Not just the report, but the slide decks and then the conversations, and continuing to have the conversations while we didn't realize that CAP had lost our thing for a bit. But it worked out well in the end, excuse me. And so we finally got a response, not knowing there'd been some administrative hiccup in June 2022. And so we were after a year of really working hard and not knowing some of the behind the scenes hiccup that had happened, this was some exhilarating. I remember when Shalom and I got this email, we were so excited news to hear this very, very positive response. One, this academics and executive committee, they welcomed our report. They highlighted the importance of community engaged scholarship as research, not, again, it can be service too, but not just a service, right? And they acknowledge the reality of this being a concern and not adequately recognized in the academic personnel review process. And they were supportive of our recommendation to use the decentralized framework model that we talked about earlier to work with divisions and to develop criteria and to work with departments, to make sure that this is discipline specific, but at the same time, there's an institutional signal and understanding that this should be recognized and rewarded in the academic personnel review process, even though we're inclusive of the different ways of doing this and framing this and practicing this. And then they also suggested, which was another great development, is that the Council on Academic Personnel should develop and disseminate faculty guidance for those preparing their dossiers on community engaged scholarship. And so this was really great news after a year of hard community organizing.
And guidance is a specific category of information on the CAP website to provide information to university faculty about what to expect in their review and how to prepare their dossiers. So this is an established practice. For instance, in the arts, there's a guidance for faculty whose scholarship is creative work. And so this is an established category of CAP offering a structure to guide the preparation of faculty dossiers. So even before we heard from the Academic Senate's Executive Committee, we started working with the Division of Social Sciences. The Dean of Social Sciences had been one of the co-authors of that 2017 Strategic Planning Task Force on Civic Engagement. And so he had an early buy-in to the idea of recognizing community engaged scholarship in academic personnel review. Even with his strong commitment, he didn't want to get out ahead of his network of department chairs and just establish this. So I worked with him over multiple meetings with the department chairs to present information to them, to hear their questions, address their concerns, and then over a series of meetings got their buy-in to have the dean create a working group of faculty members to develop criteria for evaluating community engaged scholarship as part of academic personnel review. At that point, the dean was able to appoint the working group, and the idea would be that the initial working group would develop the criteria, then vet that by sharing it with other community engaged scholars in the division, and then present that to the department chairs for further vetting. So even a multi-stage process within the single division.
So this is a little bit illustrating what Shalom was just describing in terms of the proposed scope of work for this working group. And so one is to think about what they mean by community engaged scholarship in the social sciences and some of the defining characteristics in that regard. And then what, again, this is illustrative, not exhaustive, but what would be some, in terms of thinking about standards and evaluative criteria for community engaged scholarship, what might things they think about and consider in terms of the social sciences division.
And this is constructed in part to respond to the concerns raised by the skeptics and those who are not necessarily enthusiastic. That is to say, people will say, well, where's the rigor in community engaged scholarship? Or how do we define excellence if we're not defining excellence by the prestige of the academic press or the flagship journal in the field? Or how do we define impact? So by naming these issues for the working group to struggle with and address, the intent is to lay out the criteria that not only help those who practice community engaged scholarship, but also respond to and assuage the concerns of those who don't.
Right. And share the resources that have already been developed in this field on those exact points.
So we draw from the University of Minnesota's great work in this area, which itself drew from the Community Campus Partnerships for Health. And we're using this University of Minnesota criteria as a starting point for conversation with the Social Science Division Working Group, what they like, what they don't like, what they feel is missing. And that work started in the late spring and is going to continue now into the fall.
Yeah, that's been great being able to draw on those criteria because we've been able to adapt it so far in exciting ways to the UCLA context. And so that's where we are now. We're drafting a prologue and criteria for evaluation. And that's sort of in the later stages. So we've made a lot of progress on that. And pretty soon now, we're getting close to this being reviewed by a broader network of community engaged faculty in social sciences across the social science departments. And then we'll have it reviewed by department chairs and hoping for adoption as guidelines or criteria for review of community engaged scholarship, and then broad dissemination to faculty in the division. And then hopefully using this model for other schools as a catalyst for other schools and divisions. This happened before and this has worked.
So UCLA circumstances are evolving, and we are in a fortunate situation with lots of new and good opportunities. We have the opportunity to continue working with the Council on Academic Personnel and developing their guidance. The former Dean of Social Sciences, who I mentioned as a key ally and champion, has now been named as the new Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost. He and I recently met, and he described to me his plans together with the Chancellor, who is a very strong ally and champion for public engagement, to revisit and finalize the strategic plan that got stalled right before the pandemic. And then, of course, the pandemic kind of derailed so much. He endorsed, basically all of these key ideas that are bulleted here. But before we get to them, the new Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost wants to rebuild a consensus for the value of public engagement broadly across the institution, which will set the stage for then building a community engagement advising network across all schools, encouraging deans to develop these faculty working groups on tenure and promotion, encouraging the use of Collaboratory at both the individual and the unit level, building an infrastructure for supporting assessment and incentivizing community engaged teaching, which are maybe 5 top priorities among a longer list of a longer menu of actions to support community engagement at the university. So we'll close there and use the remaining time for your questions. I see a couple in the chat, but perhaps Lauren, you'll moderate now.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you, Bimmy and Shalom, for sharing. Why don't you take a few minutes, grab some water, take a breath. Yeah, and I'll, we've got a handful of questions in the chat, and I'll just use this as a reminder if anyone has any additional follow-up questions for Bimmy and Shalom. We've got the next 20 minutes to facilitate some discussion, so please drop them in the chat or raise a hand on Zoom if you want to unmute and ask yourself. But I'll just share a few reflections. This was a really great presentation, I think, really into the nitty-gritty of how folks are doing this work with a good majority of the institutions that we work with at Collaboratory. So many of them are trying to find the starting line for this work, or how to build that momentum to start this type of work across campus or within specific units. So really appreciate you laying out your strategy and your very thoughtful strategy of how you're doing this, not just from the top down and not necessarily from the bottom up, but kind of meeting together. So I see Emily has raised her hand. So Emily, I'll let you unmute if you want to ask your question, and then I've got a few others from the chat that I can share as well.
Sure. Thanks so much for sharing this. This is a really helpful presentation with all the key points of your journey along the way. A couple of things just stuck out to me was the experience of community organizing, and that is really what a lot of this is in terms of like going door to door, person to person, knocking, and then having the right people sort of ascend. So it sounds like the new kind of provost is ascending into that position, and that can be a really key moment. And so that brings me to one of the things that really I took a note on was this idea of like, whose responsibility is it? And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about insights or lessons learned, because that feels like a really key insight. That when you would talk to one group, like the faculty, they say, oh, we're so powerless. It's the dean who has the power. It's the chancellor who has the power. And when you go to the deans, they're saying, oh, I would never get in front of my faculty and presume to shove something down their throat. Yeah. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about that insight. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a key realization when it really crystallized, and it was true that the dean didn't want to get out too far ahead of his own department chairs, even though he knew this particular dean in social sciences knew that perhaps among all of the divisions, he had the highest number of individual faculty who are doing community engaged work and who face these very issues. When we convened the working group, and initially, the conversation went round and round, like, can we really do this, or will this really matter? And there was a moment where I think I said, you have this power. You can, but by articulating this, you will shape the responses and opportunities that flow from this in the way that others will respond to you. And it was just a really interesting moment of faculty recognizing that they could take this step, and that in so many ways they had disempowered themselves. At the same time, at the senior level, CAP, as individuals, were really sympathetic and interested. They knew that they have colleagues doing this work. And and yet they didn't see the institutional role that they play. And encoding and establishing what they were agreeing to implicitly without taking the next step and saying, we can codify this. Right. What we learned in part is that all of these fronts need to move forward, not exactly simultaneously, but roughly, well, I guess simultaneously, but not necessarily at the same pace. But as long as we can, Bemi mentioned that we would use one conversation at the next meeting. So as long as we were always able to say, oh, well, when we spoke to these people, you know, they're doing this. And so we played a catalytic role by showing people at different levels of the institution movement and interest that was otherwise invisible to them. And it then gave them permission to seize the opportunity to do the next thing.
There was even at one point discussion that UCLA couldn't do this, that it had to be UC system-wide. You know, I mean, people really try to punt it. And it's interesting because then we started talking to other UCs at the same time. So all this is like happening at different places at the same time. And we've since formed, and we're part of this UC like system-wide community engagement network where we're all trying to help each other, because we realize all the UCs are thinking about this at different, we may be at slightly different places, but we're all grappling with the same thing. And how can we support each other at our institutions, but actually also UC system-wide. And so that was really interesting too.
And thank you for that. And one of the things that was helpful on our campus was creating a report, or we call it a volume, that really documented the conversations that we had across campus and sort of where we landed. Because being 10 years out, we still have new leadership coming, new faculty. And so what we've needed to do is say, you know, welcome, like we've had this discussion, here's the quick reference so you can catch up. And so that's really transformed our conversations to being about like, should we support community engaged scholarship, to, oh, I'm coming to an institution that already does, I need to figure out what that means for me as a dean. And so thanks, Kristen. So I just really am excited about the cool work that you're doing, and I'm grateful for you contributing in this way.
Yeah, we cited that report in our report.
Yeah, we have to keep learning, yeah, from each other. Thank you.
Well, I'll continue to encourage folks to drop questions or to raise a hand in Zoom. We did get a question early on that I'll put to both you, Bimi and Shalom. How or did you involve external partners to be involved in developing the criteria for evaluation or definitions?
So if by external partners, the person is meaning people outside the university, we have not. Individual divisions and schools, as they pursue this, may choose to do that, but we're very far from that stage. We are still very much at the stage of working with one division as a way of kind of a demo for other schools and divisions to be able to develop the criteria that are appropriate. What made a lot of sense here, just to be explicit about this, is that the Academic Senate really recognized that public impact scholarship or community engaged scholarship is not going to look the same in engineering as it might look in the Division of Humanities, and this is why they embrace the idea that schools and divisions should articulate their own standards for evaluative criteria. And then how that will happen, we're still on a process. I mean, I think that we've given you a timeline of the past, but I think that to be realistic, the timeline of the future is that we've got at least 3 years of work ahead of us before criteria for every school and division are fully in place. And then there's still interest and momentum to officially place the community engaged scholarship within what's referred to as the call, within the academic personnel manual, which we are not even at that stage yet. So even as we're making progress, there's still a trajectory of multiple years ahead of us.
But I think we ask like how you engage the community partners, whether it's through community advisory board, and there's many different models, and we've read the literature on that. That would be a really important best practice that you could have in the that should be discussed in the different working groups in terms of how you engage partners, who's a peer, you know, who are peers in producing knowledge and reviewing knowledge that's produced and things like that. I think there's many different engagement points on that needs to happen. And so, but because UCLA is so decentralized, it's very, that also makes it really tricky too, because it's something that our center is working on doing, and we can work with others, but it's such a huge campus, but we can encourage it as a best practice across the divisions, departments, and units. I don't know if that adds some, Shalom.
Yeah, thank you. I'll ask another question from the chat. You both have covered this more or less throughout the presentation, but curious if you could provide just kind of like bullet point answers to what are some strategies that you all have to persuade less responsive departments or faculty or staff to recognize community engaged scholarship?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. My first response is always to focus on listening, and what is it that their objections signal. So the objection is a negative version of a positive statement. What is it that they value that is embedded in the negative statement? And so this is why questions like rigor, issues like rigor show up. It's coming from sometimes it's coming from a place of fear. It's coming from a place of dislocating their own kind of scholarship. It's coming from a place of, you can't make me do this kind of response. So listening carefully to what is the objection is, from my perspective, the key to figuring out what is the appropriate response.
And I think some of our approach too was that the focus of our report were on those UCLA faculty who identified as community engaged scholars, to who for them, this is a key part of their identity as a researcher and teacher. And so, but as a lot of faculty, I mean, this is quoting from them, not everyone should be doing community engaged scholarship, that in fact, this can be quite damaging for communities, for people to be doing this who don't know what they're doing, to whom this isn't important. So it was more about creating the space that the university recognizes and values and rewards this, but there is a continuum of scholarship, and it's giving the people who want to do this the right and ability to do this and to be celebrated and rewarded, but not everyone should necessarily be doing this too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's just personally reflecting on, I think that there's a spectrum, right, of the ways that folks like in your position can go about this. This is required of everyone, this is appreciated, or we suggest this for everyone, or we're just totally going to reject it for everyone. So that you're trying to find that middle ground of acceptance and not pushing, but acceptance of all forms of, engaged scholarship. Very important. So I'll just ask one last question before we wrap up. We've got about 8 minutes left. So just, I mean, big picture, in the next 5-10 years, knowing that this work is not going to be done in the next year or so, what does, in your ideal picture, UCLA look like in 10 years in regards to valuing community engaged scholarship? And then I'll tack on to the end of that question, to get to that ideal institution, advice you have for others who are just now setting out to do this work.
That's a great, I love that, all things are possible question, Lauren. I think that with a chancellor and an executive vice chancellor and provost who are strong champions of this work, we can make significant progress in the next 5 to 10 years. And what that would look like is that community engaged scholarship is recognized along with all kinds of other forms and practices of scholarship, and the scholars who are doing this work no longer feel that they're having to do double work in order to prove themselves by doing the community engaged work as their work of passion, while doing forms of traditional scholarship to earn their tenure and promotion. And so a more equitable environment. I can imagine UCLA continuing to position itself to be more connected to communities locally, regionally, nationally, and globally, and to involve communities more in directing in the future directions of research endeavor, because we continue to be a research institution. So I think all of that is possible with the alignment of leadership and the support of scholars and the involvement of communities. The steps to get there: slogging through all of the kinds of steps that we've been describing, because we need to recognize that not all faculty who are decision makers in their departments and in various academic senate committees, we can't assume that everybody's already on board, and people have questions and people have concerns and skepticisms, and they need to be addressed. And we can't steamroll people. It's that approach we know won't work. So building the hospitable environment for this work, and addressing the concerns of other scholars to be for their work to thrive as well, I think is what will create the conditions for all of this to move forward.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I hope 5 to 10 years from now, we're seeing UCLA is seen as, in some spaces we really are, right? But seen as a reciprocal, but more across the board, as a reciprocal, sustained partner that's being invited to the table to address critical, urgent challenges that we're facing globally, locally. And so I think that would be really nice to see that. And then the other thing in terms of how you sort of get started, I think, having this identified in some of those internal documents early on gave, to have some of these anchor points where something's identified. So then that can be the platform from which you develop a larger report and have conversations with people who are doing this, have conversations with us and have conversations with other folks across the country who are doing this, and then use that report as a community organizing tool. So finding little nuggets of something that you can then leverage to something else, and then leverage to something else, and then you leverage the conversations like we talked about.
And I'll add the value of Carnegie classification, that even if you don't have a recognition process in place or criteria for faculty evaluation, your campus may very well be strong enough in so many other areas to get Carnegie classification or to get reclassified, and then use the feedback from the Carnegie classification or reclassification process as external evidence that here's a best practice that has emerged, that other colleges and universities are making progress on, and then use that as a leverage point in speaking with campus stakeholders. That's a double-edged sword in my experience. I've had maybe not just as many faculty, but I've certainly had faculty say to me, don't tell us that somebody outside of UCLA wants us to do this. We're not going to do it because somebody outside of UCLA wants us to do this. So, you can't bludgeon people with that information, but you can use it with the right partners and the right stakeholders on campus to help create the opening for campus conversation. and then get the ball rolling on campus. So the internal and external, I think, is important as long as they are leveraged appropriately.
Well, thank you so much, Bimi and Shalom, for sharing your insights and your work. I feel like this was a wonderful dialogue and really beneficial for everyone who tuned in, who is thinking in this space, and really your work is very aspirational. So very much appreciate you sharing, and wishing you all the best as you continue the next years and years of work. I will also use this time just to let everyone know we are sending out a recording of this. So in a few days, we'll send out a recording if you want to rewatch and relive the memories. We'll also post to our website so other folks who weren't able to be here today can view and listen in. I'll also use this time to put in a shameless plug for our Collaboratory Summit. So next month in October, every fall we host a virtual summit for the entire field. We have some sessions that are open to everyone where we'll share. We've got a panel of national experts. We're excited to have Valerie Holton from Kumu, Marisol Morales from Carnegie and ACE, Lynn Broadbender from Askew, and Marshall Curry from the Epic Inn Network, who will sit on a panel talking about community engagement work more broadly at the national level. And then we've got a few days that are just reserved for working group sessions for the collaboratory institutions we work with. And then on Thursday, October 20th, we're hosting a panel of administrators, much like Shalom and Bimi, from other campuses who leverage Collaboratory and more specifically look at community engagement data across the institution, and they'll share their insights. So we're happy to have Elaine Ward from Merrimack and Kelly Huth, formerly from Binghamton, and Stacy Bluth from NC State. So anyone who wants to continue the conversation about community engagement data more broadly, we would love to have you join our summits. And thanks again for joining. Kristen linked the summit in the chat. You're free to go. You're always free to go. But if anyone wants to stick around and has questions specifically for me or my wonderful colleague, Kristen, I'm happy to stay on. But thanks again for your time. We appreciate you being here.